After Japan's surrender in World War II, there were a number of Japanese soldiers who continued to fight a war that was no longer occurring. Many of these soldiers were stationed in remote countryside and either thought the news of Japan's surrender was merely American propaganda intended to trick them, or didn't receive any communication at all. There were even some holdouts who knew Japan had surrendered, they just didn't agree with it. Well, today I'll be talking about one of Japan's longest holdouts, a man who fought on until 1974, making him the second last Japanese soldier to surrender. Why not make a video on the very last holdout? His story wasn't quite as interesting. Hiroo Onoda was born in Japan in 1922. When he was 18, he joined the Imperial Japanese Army to fight in World War II. So, early on, his destiny is already on a collision course with disaster. That's a bit like a story starting out with the purchase of a ticket for the fucking Titanic. The ship, that is, not the movie. Actually, yeah, the movie too. After enlisting, Onoda was chosen for specialised intelligence training. Here he learned guerrilla warfare and covert operations. In December 1944, he was sent to the Japanese-occupied Lubang Island in the Philippines. His role would be to sabotage the oncoming American-Filipino landings by destroying the airstrip and the pier at the harbour, and etc., etc. When he arrived in Lubang, however, the officers there had other ideas. Onoda instead was put to use in the preparations for a Japanese evacuation. So, when the Allies did land in February 1945, they were greeted by not only a diminished fighting force, but a lovely smooth airstrip to land on and an accommodating pier. This allowed the combined forces of the US and the Commonwealth of the Philippines to take the island with relative ease. As the Japanese were busy fleeing or dying, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi gave Onoda his final orders to hamper the Allied forces for as long as possible. It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens, we'll come back for you. Soon after the landing, Onoda and 3 others were all that remained of the Japanese fighting force on Lubang: Private Akatsu, Corporal Shimada, and Private First Class Kozuka. Since he had been promoted to lieutenant, Onoda took charge of the men and they all retreated to the hills. From here, the men conducted guerrilla operations against the military and local villagers. They lived off supplies raided from the locals, as well as wild coconuts and bananas. Something about guerrillas living off bananas is amusing to me. They maintained their uniform, equipment and weaponry and would attack those they suspected of working with the Allies. Japan surrendered in August of that year, but the men were completely unaware for months, until they came across leaflets telling them the war was over. Having been trained to never surrender, Onoda guessed the leaflets were American propaganda intended to demoralize Japanese forces into surrendering prematurely. Which, I suppose, is a fairly reasonable guess, given that they had no other information to go on and were tasked with indefinite resistance to Allied forces. What isn't reasonable is to continue with this line of thinking for 29 fucking years. But that's exactly what he did. And the men weren't just hiding away in the mountains either. Like I said, they would attack anyone they suspected of being an enemy of Japan, and got into numerous firefights with the local villagers and authorities over the years. They killed over 30 fucking people. What a fucking way to go, killed by a band of fucking larpers. Over time, more attempts were made to convince the soldiers to stop arsing around playing cowboy in the mountains and return to normal life like everybody else. Leaflets were airdropped as well as letters from the men's families, but they concluded that these were all tricks. And this is what I mean when I say this is no longer a reasonable line of thinking. This is an awful lot of trouble to go to get 4 fucking gobshites to surrender when you could just send up a few lads to take care of them. Or just bomb them. The Americans had plenty of experience bombing the Japanese at this point. Private Akatsu possibly possessed more brains than the others because he left the 3 of them in 1949, although even he spent the next 6 months out on his own before finally surrendering to Philippine forces in 1950. For some reason, they never got this guy to go back and tell the others that the war was actually over and they'd spent the last 5 years just murdering random people for no reason. In 1953, the men got into a firefight with local fishermen and Corporal Shimada was hit in the leg. He eventually recovered until in 1954 the men engaged a search party out looking for them and he was killed. In 1972, during a raid on local farmers, police showed up and fought with the 2 remaining soldiers, killing Private First Class Kazuka. For the next 2 years, Lieutenant Onoda fought the war by himself. Not even unreasonable anymore, just absolute madness at this point. In 1974, he was found by Norio Suzuki, a Japanese student and adventurer. The 2 became friends, but Onoda still refused to surrender, saying he would have to be ordered by a superior officer. Suzuki returned to Japan armed with this knowledge, as well as photos of the 2 together as proof. Upon learning this, the Japanese government located Major Taniguchi, now a bookseller, and he travelled to Lubang Island to fulfill his promise to Onoda of coming back to get him. Taniguchi ordered Onoda to surrender. In accordance with the Imperial Command, the 14th Area Army has ceased all combat activity. In accordance with Military Headquarters Command Number A-2003, the Special Squadron of Staff's headquarters is relieved of all military duties. Units and individuals under the command of Special Squadron are to cease military activities and operations immediately and place themselves under the command of the nearest superior officer. When no officer can be found, they are to communicate with the American or Philippine forces and follow their directives. Onoda, still dressed in his decades-old uniform, saluted, wept, and handed over his gear. An Arisaka Type 99 rifle, 500 rounds of ammo, several hand grenades, and a dagger his mother had given him in 1944 to commit suicide with in the event he was captured. Well, you can't say it isn't a thoughtful gift. Onoda gave up his sword to Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos in surrender. Marcos accepted his surrender and even returned his sword. Onoda never faced punishment for killing all those people due to the fact he really believed he was at war. I'm sure that went over well with the victims' families. There was only one other Japanese holdout that fought for longer. That's right, there was Onoda one, haha. Private Nakamura in Indonesia, but he surrendered later that same year. Hiroo Onoda returned to Japan, where he was greeted as a hero, but much had changed from 1944 to 1974, and he was disillusioned with modern Japan and the abandonment of traditional Japanese values. He moved to Sao Paulo, Brazil in 1974, raised cattle, and got married. He and his wife returned to Japan in 1984, where he founded a youth camp to teach young'uns survival skills. In 1996, he revisited Lubang and made a $10,000 donation to a school there. The rest of his life he spent alternatively between Brazil and Japan until he passed away of heart failure in 2004. Hiroo Onoda was 91 when he died. What an interesting tale. It's especially interesting to think about how a man came out of fighting World War II and into the 1970s, and how he would see that world. I suppose it's not too surprising that he rejected modern life. If you came straight out of the 1940s and into the 70s, you'd probably be pretty conservative by comparison. That's unlike the fictional Captain America, who after being frozen in World War II conveniently awakes in the modern world with the same progressive values as whoever's writing him that week. Well, that's people with arts degrees for you. If you'd like to support art that's not made by some tool with an arts degree, consider subscribing to me and following me on Twitter and donating on Patreon. And until the day I move out to LA and become a vapid, empty husk of a human being, I'll continue being miserably cynical. Cheers.